This is a presentation on the B-58 Hustler, the Mach 2 4-engine delta wing jet bomber that was active in the 1960s. On the left, above the 43rd Bomb Wing, are patches worn on flying suits by crew members first at Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, and later Little Rock, Arkansas. On the right, 305th Bomb Wing, as patches were worn on crews from the 305th that was in Bunker Hill, Indiana, later called Grissom Air Force Base. And down below, here are patches made long after the B-58 was deactivated. This one here on the lower right is the official emblem of the B-58 Hustler Association. Here's a nice painting of Firefly given to me by Robert Cunningham, who crewed this aircraft. On the side of the nose here is written Firefly. Each B-58 had its own nickname, and it was etched on the left nose of the airplanes. Here's a graphic with some of the details on the B-58. Its length was 97 feet, wingspan 57 feet, maximum gross weight for taxi 164,000 pounds, and the maximum weight in flight 176,890 pounds. Some people ask how could it weigh more in flight than it can to take off, and that's due to air refueling. You can refuel in flight to a greater weight than you can take off with. Here's a nice silhouette showing the pinched waist of the Hustler. Just after the wing joins the fuselage tapers in, and that's known as the Whitcomb area rule, the Coke bottle effect that allows it to transition through the Mach barrier more easily than it could have otherwise. Here's a B-58 that was at the Air Force Museum. Outside, now it's inside, but they have 4 J-79 variable afterburner engines. They produce 10,300 pounds of thrust and 100% military power, and when you light the afterburners, 15,500 pounds of thrust. It's not much by today's standards, but back in the 1950s that was quite a bit of thrust. Same engine on the F-4 and the F-104. Its maximum speed was Mach 2.2. Here's a Hustler painting provided by Bob Garrett, a tech sergeant, retired Air Force. Here's some of the equipment that the B-58 could carry, and on further slides here we'll show individual portions of it. Under the belly we carried a pod. Initially it was an MB-1 pod, a single unit pod, but later they developed this two-component pod where you had the bottom here, which was carried primarily fuel, and the upper portion that set inside the lower, that was either a nuclear weapon or, when you didn't have nukes on board, cement ballast, because you needed the weight for center of gravity purposes. Then we had 4 smaller nuclear weapons carried 2 in tandem on each side of the fuselage under the wings. We had a couple of different radomes we could put on it. The standard one was the radar disc. And we had also some different pods that we could put under. We had some photopods and some electronic countermeasure pods, etc. Here's the B-58 in flight with the weapons. These 4 nuclear weapons, each one is 1 megaton yield. That's 1 million tons of explosive power. And then the upper portion here is the larger one. I forget exactly. I think it's around 4 or 5 megatons yield. The lower pod is gone here in this particular shot. If you had the World War III, the GO code, and you finished air refueling, the last refueling, and used up the fuel in the lower portion pod, you'd jettison that and carry this nuclear pod into the target area. This shows the flight crew boarding the aircraft from the stand, which is designed for the B-58 because we had to enter from above. This shows a 3-man crew, pilot in front. He's got his windows. Behind him, the bomb nav equipment, and then the navigator, and behind him, the defensive systems operator. These two squares here are windows. That's all the navigator and the DSO have to look out with. It was the B-58 was initially designed with ejection seats, but later fitted with individual crew capsules, so that it made supersonic ejection safer. This slide shows the pilot's capsule when it's closed. We normally flew with it open, as in the one on the right, but when we closed the pilot's capsule, you can see there was a window that you could see your instruments. You had the control stick inside with you, so you could fly the aircraft without ejecting if you were encapsulating because of other problems, perhaps lack of pressurization or smoke or fire. The nav DSO capsule, this shows it open. They have no flight control stick, and they also have a smaller window. If you had encapsulated and decided you needed to eject, you'd squeeze the triggers, and then explosive shells blow off the canopy and start the capsule up the track. About halfway up, a rocket motor fires to take it away and clear. As it clears the aircraft, the stabilization fins pop out, and the stabilization chute, a small one, is deployed. If you're above 15,000 feet, it free falls down to 15,000 feet, and there's some oxygen and pressurization available. If there's an aneroid barometer, then automatically, hopefully, at 15,000 feet pressure altitude, the recovery chute is deployed, reef for 2 seconds, and then it will open all the way. Later, right near the end, they put an extra handle inside the capsule, so if the automatic didn't work, the crew member inside could pull that handle and deploy the chute himself. Later on, after the main chute's out, another delay initiator is fired, and that changes the position, allows the to come down seat first, and these flotation booms extend. On touchdown, if you're on land, shock absorbers absorb some of the shock, and then you pull a parachute disconnect handle, which is inside the capsule with you. And when you do that, the upper flotation cells only are inflated, and the bridle lines to the chute are released. You have an oxygen hose inside that you can connect to a snorkel if you're in water, and the lower flotation cells can be inflated. There's like a fireplace bellows under each seat. Hook it to a connection, and 600 actuations of the bellows will inflate the other cells. They did some testing on plateau. They had a bearer in some of those capsule ejection tests. It was planned that the capsule would land at the foot of this plateau, but due to winds, the capsule was blown onto the side of the hill about halfway down, and it tumbled end over end to the bottom, and that was one angry bear when they opened up the capsule. Inside, if you're encapsulated, you had some of these buttons on here that were designed just for encapsulation use, and most of them, though, were designed to be used whether you're encapsulated or not. This throttle retard button you'd use if you're encapsulated and can't reach the throttles. Press that button and the throttles would come out of afterburner, and you could descend and decelerate out of supersonic that way. Here's the nose wheel steering button. You press it once, it engages, and you press it again, it disengages the nose wheel steering. But in flight, it's a air refueling reset button or automatic or disconnect button. This is a CG shift switch. There's a balance tank and a tail that contains fuel. I move this switch forward, and it moves fuel out of the balance tank forward and changes your percent MAC, or move the switch to the rear and it moves fuel into that balance tank, and each 1,000 pounds that's moved will change the percent MAC about 1%. Here's the bailout warning switch. You normally tell them over interphone to bail out, but you lift the guard and flip the switch, and that gives a final warning light for bailout. Microphone switch, pretty standard. One way is you're transmitting, and the other way is interphone, unless you're on hot microphone. Autopilot trigger switch, which you'd only use if you're encapsulated. If you have the autopilot engaged and you encapsulate, you could pull this switch halfway in and it would disconnect the autopilot, but the autopilot switches remain up, and then you could decelerate and descend out of supersonic. Once you got down to a safe altitude and a safe attitude, you could release that switch. It pops out and it would re-engage the autopilot. Pull the switch all the way in and it completely disconnects the autopilot, and you'd have to be uncapsulated to engage it. Here's the aileron elevator function of the elevons switch. Left and right is roll correction, and up and down is pitch correction, the elevator function of the elevons. Here's a nice shot of the B-58 pilot's cockpit. Here's the fuel panel, flight instruments, flight guidance information, and those you see here, this shows nice. These are the padded bars that come down. If you encapsulate, hits the ankles and brings your feet inside. So here's the fuel panel over on the right, and on the right of the forward panel are the engine instruments. To the left on the forward are the flight instruments, and over here are items peculiar to the B-58, aileron rudder interconnect and the elevator available windows, and a caution light that comes on, a Mach monitor lamp that comes on when you're supersonic. There's a landing gear handle, throttles. Move the throttles forward to 100%, lift them up, shove them into afterburner, and you have about 4 inches of afterburner range. And on some occasions you pick them up again, put them over another stop, and you can put them into manually selected overspeed. Here's the nav radio, and up here are some of the flight control power switches. This shows the left side. Again, this shows this bar that comes out with a padded end here, and that's the one that we said hits your ankle, brings your feet in, so that when the capsule closes, it won't cut off your toes. These handles here override the automatic flight control and give you the amount of elevon and elevator control that you want, regardless of the automatic switches. Another one doing the same thing. Here's the right side. There's the pad that comes on your right ankle to bring your right foot in. And here's the fuel control panel. It's pretty normal, except we had a percent MAC readout here that read the center of gravity, and you could dial in what you wanted, move the switch to automatic, and it would automatically move fuel to or from that balance tank in the tail to give you the center of gravity you wanted. This is the pressurization panel, electrical panel, annunciator panel, the caution and warning lights that come on when something is wrong. Plus, we were one of the first aircraft that had a lady's voice for each one, pre-recorded, so she would tell you what the light says, so you didn't have to turn your head down there and look. This is a pulley affair here. There's a little plastic or leather bag attached to it, and it's put small items in there, and you couldn't, have any physical contact with the other two crew members, but you could use this manually with a clothesline type affair, move the bag back to exchange items. Here's the navigator's position. Here's his nav scope and all of his buttons here to control everything, and they're all magic. over here on the right, behind this area here, is a small control stick that if the autopilot is engaged and the pilot becomes disabled, the navigator can fly the aircraft a little to maintain a stable platform until the pilot recovers. Of course, he can't land because he has no landing gear control handle, and he can't see forward. He's only got those small side windows. Here's the DSO's position. He's got his airspeed, altimeter, and other information up here. Plus now these are all the individual fuel tanks, and he kept the fuel log and maintained the center of gravity in the proper position. The DSO did a lot of the co-pilot type activities. He read the checklist, he handled air traffic control stuff, and did a lot of the communications with bomb plot and other people we might be having communication with. Tail cannon control. There's a scope here. You could see enemy fighters approaching, and he had a rotating barrel cannon in the tail, and he could set it up to have it shoot down the enemy fighter. And down the bottom are electronic countermeasure switches, some of the devices he had to defeat enemy radar. This shows the fuselage pod being installed. The pod again hangs forward, and if the interior tanks might be full, if you took the pod off, it would sit on its tail. So anytime they take the pod off, they generally have a cement ballast they hook just behind the nose wheel to hold the nose down when they take the pod off. Here shows them loading it from the rear. This is aircraft 660, the first B-58 to fly. There was no pod under the belly, and so they had no fuel for that, plus they couldn't fill the aft tank full because of center of gravity restrictions. But here it is. It comes back into park after the first flight on November the 11th, 1956, with the crowd observing from the side, and this is flight number 1 in November the 11th, 1956. Here's a Hustler taxiing out from the parking spot on the flight line, and we'll go through an abbreviated flight to show some of the characteristics. Here's a TB-58 taxiing out for takeoff. You can't see too good, but there are extra windows up front because they took the nav bomb equipment out and the navigator position out and put another pilot position behind and slightly offset so that the instructor pilot could teach the pilots how to fly the TB-58, and then the navigator didn't get to fly until we started flying the B model. There were no capsules on the TB-58, just the original ejection seats. The capsule would have probably blocked the instructor pilot's view forward. Here's a B-58 is starting to take off roll. They got fewer windows here. Bring the throttles up to military power, then raise them, move them forward to light all 4 afterburners, and then you advance to full afterburner for takeoff. At about 200 knots, you rotate the nose up, and the Hustler becomes airborne around 220 knots. Depends on the weight, of course. Come out, thrust is reduced out of afterburner at 350 knots indicated, and the initial climb speed is 425 knots until you reach 0.9 Mach, and then you climb at 0.9 Mach to cruise altitude. This is 660, that first Hustler flown. It's the only one that had this distinctive paint scheme. Notice how close the pod is to the nose landing gear, which retracts up and aft. To be able to do that, it's hinged up in this area here, and the bottom 2/3 about rotates up and forward till it clears the pod. Then the whole apparatus comes back and up into the nose gear well. Here's a nice picture of night takeoff with full afterburner. This painting was inspired by the record-setting low-level flight of a Hustler from Texas to California, flown at 600 knots indicated, never higher than 500 feet above the ground. And here's a Hustler approaching a KC-135 tanker for air refueling. Here he's moving up forward into approaching the contact position. And now he's in contact. Normally we air refueled around 30,000 feet. If you did refuel to a maximum weight, 176.9, sometimes it became power limited, and so it wasn't a real problem. The pilot would just light an inboard afterburner and reduce power on the other three engines to maintain the position on the boom. But of course the boom operator in the tanker is looking down at you, so you want to warn him first, because when he sees the flame coming out of your engine, he might think you're on fire and do an emergency breakaway. The Hustler refueled easily. It had pitch roll and yaw dampers, had auto trim elevons, and automatic elevator available, and automatic elevator trim. After you're through with air refueling, you might do high altitude navigation, low level oil burner routes, and simulated bomb runs, or supersonic high altitude work, but in our case we'll just return for landing. In the traffic pattern, we flew it at 250 knots till we slowed to base at 220 knots on base leg. Final also at 220 if you're at the maximum weight for approaches, but too heavy to land. Once you got down to landing weight, speed was about 200 to 210 on final, with touchdown a little below 190 knots. On final, they maintain the proper speed using the indicated airspeed indicator, but also there's an angle of attack indicator shown in up in the glare shield that a 12.5 degree angle of attack lights up the green donut to show you're on the proper speed. About 10 feet above the ground, throttles idle, slight flare for landing. You couldn't see down the runway at touchdown because of the high nose attitude. So after touchdown, you lower the nose to about this attitude, making sure you're lined up with the runway, put out the brake chute, and then raise the nose back up to 17 degrees for aerodynamic braking till you get down to 100 knots. Then you lower the nose to the runway, clear the runway, get on the brakes, and jettison the chute. Here's the artist version of the Hustler flying chase on the B-70 Valkyrie. And here's an actual photo of the Hustler flying chase on the B-70. This picture shows some of the details on the Hustler, and we'll break them apart and show the next few pages to enlarge so you can see those details. Here's the radome. Of course, the antenna dish is in there for the navigator, and in this area up in here is the air refueling receptacle. Each engine had an inlet spike that was normally retracted, except when you went supersonic. Once you got up above Mach 1.42, electric motors in each one began extending the spike out in front of the engine to keep the supersonic shock wave out of the intake. We're talking over here about the pod under the belly. Initially we had the MB-1C pod, and then later got the two-component pod, which offered more capability than the MB-1C. Here it is, showing it right here. And then the discussion here is about the tires. We have 8 tires on each bogie, so 8 and 16, and 2 on the nose. That's 18. So we're driving an 18-wheeler. Each tire had 240 psi of nitrogen. They're very small tires so that they could retract up into the wing. The wing wasn't very thick. The same tires on the F-16. Wing structure, the leading edge of the wing was titanium to absorb the heat, and then the whole area of the wing was a honeycombed aluminum sandwich skin. Nose wheel we talked about, it's hinged about in this area here, so that the lower portion comes up and then the whole thing slides back up and into the wheel well. Being a true delta, it didn't have an elevator. It had the elevons, and The elevons provide both roll and pitch. Chaff dispensers were above the wheel wells. Rudder, we had a single piece rudder, and in case we didn't have full fuel tanks, sometimes the fuel would start to pool on one side to make it wing heavy. They had a system that noticed that and would apply a little bit of rudder to move it back and keep the balance proper. Some of the data: first flight, November the 11th, 1956. They built 116, delivered the last one in October of 62. 26 were destroyed in accidents, and that killed 36 aircrew members. Maximum speed, Mach 2, 600 knots indicated, or ram air temperature of 115 degrees Celsius, whichever was more limiting. However, momentarily you could go up to Mach 2.2. There's 650 to 660 knots indicated, depending upon temperature and pressure altitude. Combat ceiling, supersonic, was 63,000 feet. The record height, they climbed it to 85,360 feet, came right back down again, and won the second Harmon Trophy. They won the Thompson Trophy, 1,284 miles per hour, in January of 61, and then the Blériot Trophy, 1,302 miles per hour, in May of 61. They won the Harmon and McKay Trophies, New York to Paris, 3 hours and 40 minutes, with an average ground speed of 1,089 miles per hour, in May of 1961. Here are pictures of the trophies won by the B-58 Hustler. Many of the Hustler's records are still in place for its type, weight, and cargo. Harmon Trophy here, the Blériot Trophy, the McKay Trophy, the Thompson Trophy, and the Bendix Trophy. When you went supersonic Mach 2 the first time, when you came down, they'd give you this card, and it says here that this certifies that this person is a member of a select group of airmen who have flown at a speed greater than Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. This is my card on 12/27/1967, and it was quite an instance. Here's my crew and the instructor crew. On the left, here's Charlie Creech, my DSO, Bob Warren, the instructor DSO, Frank Giaquinto, the instructor nav, Herc Neifert, my navigator, Daryl Schmidt, pilot, and Moose Fordham, instructor pilot. And here's Moose. After the first flight in the B model, we were met by the instructor crew, and he's giving me a model B-58 as an award for making it. And then they also had chilled champagne, so we could toast the whole thing. And this is me on the left, and Charlie Creech, DSO, and Herc Neifert, the nav. First flight in the B-58. Here's a closing picture of the B-58 Hustler from the back cover of one of the most recent B-58 Hustler Association membership rosters. And this is me holding up the nose. It's not quite very clear, but it's the only one I could find. And this completes this presentation on the B-58 Hustler.